Alaska Airlines passengers bracing for an emergency landing earlier tonight after a section of the plane blew off mid-flight.
I reached over and held his hands, and we literally thought that we were going to die.
Welcome to On Strike, a production of Workers Strike Back. My name is Bia Lacombe.
And I'm Shama Sawant. 2 weeks ago, in a near disaster in mid-air, an Alaska Airlines flight was forced to make an emergency landing after a side door ripped off the plane. Passengers reported being sure they were going to die.
When the oxygen mask came down, my mind was like, oh my God, something is seriously wrong. You could hear the heavy breathing. And then from there, I just kept thinking of my family. It was hard we were all trying not to panic.
Just by chance, no one was sitting near the door. Otherwise, there would likely have been casualties. The plane was a Boeing 737 MAX, which has a scandal-filled history that we'll get into in a bit. Since the incident, the Federal Aviation Administration, or the FAA, has grounded all Boeing 737 MAX 9 planes for further investigation and inspection. As Alaska Airlines and also United Airlines have inspected their Boeing MAX 9 planes, they've reported finding loose bolts on a number of them. This news has exposed and brought attention to a wider breakdown which implicates not just Boeing executives, but the aviation industry as a whole, including federal regulators. It is just the latest symptom of a system in complete crisis. But before we get started, I wanted to talk about the Workers Strike Back membership drive. Become a member now to help ensure Workers Strike Back can continue to organize to rebuild a fighting labor movement, and that On Strike can continue to bring you coverage of a wide range of issues from a working class perspective you won't find on mainstream media. On Strike doesn't run any ads, we don't accept any corporate money, and we rely entirely on donations from working people to support our work.
You're not alone, right? You're not just sitting on your couch, doom scrolling, reading all these different terrible news stories alone, that there are thousands and in reality millions of working class people who feel just as frustrated and also want to see a path forward, who know that higher wages, high quality healthcare, and high quality housing are totally possible.
We're building on the example of the past decade in Seattle on a national scale to widen and strengthen the class struggle. Who here wants to be a part of that movement?
Go to workersstrikeback.org and click on Become a Member. Perhaps the most jolting statistic illustrating the disastrous situation in the aviation industry is the one reported by the New York Times last summer. After analyzing a NASA database that contains confidential safety reports filed by pilots, air traffic controllers, and others in aviation from 2022, a study showed that there were close to 300 instances of near collisions involving commercial airlines in domestic U.S. flights. 2 such near misses occurred last July within 10 days of each other. They were such dangerously close shaves that the FAA's internal records described the 2 encounters as quote-unquote skin to skin. There have been numerous media reports over the last decade of the crisis faced by flight attendants, air traffic controllers, pilots, ground crew, and workers in the Transportation Security Administration, or TSA. The serious and ongoing issues include extreme overwork, mandatory overtime, low wages, undermined benefits, and an epidemic of mental health decline. Air traffic controllers are being systematically forced to work around the clock and are being pushed to the brink, which is at the root of these dangerously close calls. The widespread mental health issues faced by pilots received major headlines in October when pilot Joseph Emerson was charged with trying to crash an Alaska Airlines flight. The pilot told police he had not slept in 40 hours, had recently experimented with magic mushrooms, and had been depressed for months, if not years. Pilots, air traffic controllers, and others in the industry have reported lying about mental health problems so that they don't risk their jobs due to stringent industry rules. This leads them to avoid getting the treatment they desperately need. Aviation corporations, from airlines to aerospace manufacturers, put profits first and the needs of workers and the passengers last. They have long fought to undermine unions and have attacked workers' rights. These same corporations have been systematically putting the public at risk by cutting corners to increase profits, leading to deadly crashes and other incidents. Meanwhile, the FAA has proved largely incapable of regulating the industry. Rather than take the responsibility for the disastrous results of putting profits before safety, aviation corporations are quick to blame flight crews for anything that goes wrong with a flight. In fact, it was the skillful response of the flight crew that kept everyone alive in the recent Alaska Airlines incident. It's the airline bosses and capitalism that are making air travel increasingly dangerous.
This industry-wide crisis has grown under both Democrats and Republicans, who gladly underfund regulatory agencies like the FAA while giving enormous tax breaks to wildly profitable companies like Boeing. Here in Washington state, in 2013, Democratic Governor Jay Inslee and the Democratic-controlled legislature gave Boeing a whopping $8.7 billion in tax breaks through 2040 if it located the final assembly of the 777X in the state. At the time, Boeing executives and state Democrats claimed that the tax handout was necessary to save jobs. But Boeing dramatically cut jobs anyway. By 2017, they had cut 12,655 jobs, or more than 15% of its Washington workforce.
The chief lobbyist at the Boeing company was Tim Keating then. He said that $8.7 billion was never Washington State's. It was always our $8.7 billion. And so they didn't give it to us. We kept it. And this is a zero-sum game. You know, they're going to put the factory somewhere. Why do they go after all these tax incentives from different states? Because they can. You just didn't have the nerve to do it, right? But they do have the nerve to do it, and they do. So again, part of that supply chain management mentality is every subordinate stakeholder yields gains to the primary stakeholder. Nobody ever says no.
Boeing has made record profits since then and engaged in stock buybacks to further enrich wealthy shareholders. Meanwhile, Washington state Democrats and Republicans who defended this largest corporate handout in U.S. history claim there isn't enough money to fund things like public education and affordable housing. In this industry in shambles, workers are starting to fight back. In February, members of the Association of Flight Attendants will hold a day of action with pickets at airports worldwide. Last year, TSA workers won a 31% wage increase, a first for them. Workers at Boeing supplier Spirit Aerosystems, who are unionized with the International Association of Machinists and Aerospace Workers, or IAM, went on a 5-day strike last summer and won a contract that ends mandatory overtime and raises wages 23% over 4 years. But far more is needed. In many ways, the decline in the airline industry can be traced back to the brutal breaking up of the historic strike of air traffic controllers in 1981 by Republican President Ronald Reagan. We'll come back to that later to review the lessons from that consequential defeat for the labor movement. We need to learn the lessons of past worker struggles because of the opportunities we're seeing today with the high popularity of unions and the strategic importance of worker action in economic choke points like airlines and airports, and in logistics industry corporations like UPS and Amazon. The only way to start fixing the aviation industry and ensure it functions in the interest of worker and public safety will be by workers organizing and using their collective power to win major changes.
Boeing's problems with the 737 MAX didn't start yesterday. In 2019, Ethiopian Airlines Flight 302 crashed and 157 people died. Just a few months earlier in 2018, Lion Air Flight 610 crashed near Indonesia and killed 189 people. These two flights were both operating Boeing 737 MAX 8s, and the story of this plane helps expose the rot at the center of this and other capitalist industries with their never-ending race for profits.
In business school thinking, if you're dealing with a commodity, it's not performance-driven, it's cost-driven. You can negotiate for price, and the performance is not an issue. That's how they see the company. And all of us on the inside, we're on the other side of the barrier where we're thinking about the materials and the processes and some chemistry and some heat treating and stress analysis and thermodynamics and aerodynamics. The design and manufacturing and service is highly performance driven. So we see that. They don't.
The two biggest airplane manufacturers in the world are Airbus and Boeing, and they are longtime rivals. In 2011, Airbus announced a new type of engine on their popular domestic shorter-range aircraft that would save fuel and therefore lots of money for commercial airlines. Part of the big appeal of this Airbus plane was that it was still essentially the same plane as before, so it wouldn't require the crew to go through a lot of new training to operate it. It was a big success. Boeing, frantic to keep selling more planes than Airbus, raced to upgrade the engine on their domestic plane and called it the 737 MAX. Because of the way the Boeing plane was originally designed, they had to place the engine higher up on the wing so that it would fit, which seemed like a small change, but this impacted the angle at which the plane took off, which could cause it to stall. To fix this, Boeing executives decided to install a computer system that could automatically push the nose of the plane down. But because Boeing was also selling the MAX as essentially the same plane that would require little additional training, they didn't tell pilots about this software and didn't include it in any handbooks or manuals. When the software malfunctioned and pushed the planes down until they crashed, pilots couldn't figure out how to stop it in time. That's what happened in the Ethiopian Airlines and Lion Air crashes. Hundreds of people died because Boeing sacrificed basic safety procedures in its race to keep up market share with its competitor.
Somebody had said, why are we doing that? Why do we have these do we have to have quality assurance people? Not only, this was after the first crash, after the Lion Air one, between the Lion Air one and the Ethiopian Air one. Here you're hearing from people at their crew meetings that the engineering managers are passing this along as a good thing. Like, why shouldn't we be thinking about stuff like this? I mean, is there something we could get rid of? Just because we've always had QA doesn't mean, we always will. And it's like, do you hear what's coming out of your mouth? Where we just had this crash and we look like dirt, and you're saying, and we all feel terrible. Everybody at Boeing felt like personally responsible for this. Haven't we already cut enough? What's left? You're burning the furniture to stay warm when you get rid of the QA guys.
Following these crashes, the FAA grounded all Boeing 737 MAX planes in March of 2019, much like they're doing again today after the Alaska Airlines incident. Then, in July 2019, Boeing posted its largest ever quarterly loss. So executives started doing everything possible to get the MAX back in the air, but with only minor adjustments to the plane itself. Instead, they used their deep pockets to make it happen politically, spending tens of millions of dollars lobbying federal politicians and the FAA, which eventually ungrounded the planes. According to a Senate report from 2020, Boeing and the FAA worked together to manipulate recertification tests following the two fatal crashes. The report's authors say that, quote, the FAA and Boeing were attempting to cover up important information that may have contributed to the 737 MAX tragedies, end quote. The FAA is also accused of retaliating against whistleblowers, possibly obstructing the Office of the Inspector General's investigation into the crashes, failing to hold senior managers accountable, and allowing Southwest Airlines to operate dozens of improperly certified planes. Despite this damning report, the 737 MAX was back in the air across the country. Even some Boeing shareholders speculated that Boeing had bought itself a regulatory-free pass from federal safety officials, rather than addressing the underlying issue. In 2020, these shareholders put forward a proposal to the Boeing board of directors that would force Boeing to more comprehensively disclose its lobbying. Current Republican presidential candidate Nikki Haley was a member of Boeing's board when it successfully killed that proposal. Haley had helped Boeing bust a union drive when she was a state lawmaker in South Carolina, and then joined the company's board for a year in 2019. Boeing's lobbying war continues today. According to news site The Lever, Boeing spent more than $10.6 million in the first 3 quarters of 2023 alone, pressuring lawmakers to grant safety exemptions. And they've won big. One such stipulation requires the FAA to give manufacturers 50 days advance notice before a quality system audit. It's like being slipped the questions in advance of a high-stakes exam. According to the New York Times, quote, The FAA has for years outsourced to corporate employees some oversight of the certification of airplanes and airplane parts, end quote. This appears to be a real understatement. At Boeing, the FAA used to nominate designated engineers who would have federal officials' protection to push back on management attempting to cut corners. Now, the FAA's point of contact is the head of the company, who reports on themselves based on a quote-unquote relationship of trust and confidence. This was established after there had already been devastating crashes. According to the New York Times, by 2018, the FAA was letting Boeing certify 96% of its own work. This shocking corruption and lack of any real oversight is even more glaring when you look at one of Boeing's main subcontractors, Spirit Aerosystems, the company which reportedly built the door that blew out in the recent Alaska Airlines flight. The Lever reported that in a recent federal court filing, Spirit employees alleged that they repeatedly warned corporate officials about safety problems and were told to falsify records. Workers alleged that they were told to misrepresent the number of defects, and that in reality there were an excessive number of defects in their products. This is an industry where precision is absolutely crucial to ensuring safety, all the way down to the smallest ball bearings. Yet according to these workers, there was a zero-tolerance policy for those raising safety concerns. Workers who reported the real number of defects or who complained about being forced to falsify records were demoted or moved to different positions. The lawsuit argues that the FAA has failed to properly regulate companies like Spirit, which instead was awarded a $75 million public subsidy from Pete Buttigieg's transportation department in 2021. The company reported more than $5 billion in revenues in 2022. Boeing and Spirit are very closely connected, with executives often hopping from one to the other. Spirit used to be Boeing Wichita in Kansas. It appears Boeing spun off the company into Spirit Aerosystems in no small part so they could crush the union at that location.
These are highly profitable corporations with huge amounts of power to get away with their abuses. It should be no surprise then that the crisis among aviation industry workers is truly profound and growing. Workers in every part of the industry, from those who build the planes to those who fly them, care about passenger safety and want to do their jobs to the highest standard. But they're forced into crushing working conditions that make this virtually impossible, all so their company's wealthy executives and shareholders can get even wealthier. A New York Times investigation last month revealed how a, quote, nationwide shortage of air traffic controllers had resulted in an exhausted and demoralized workforce that was increasingly prone to making dangerous mistakes, end quote. In the best of conditions, these jobs force workers to operate under intense pressure with thousands of lives at stake. But they are not working in the best of conditions, far from it. According to the Times, quote, air traffic controllers and others have submitted hundreds of complaints to a Federal Aviation Administration hotline describing issues like dangerous staffing shortages, mental health problems, and deteriorating buildings, some infested with bugs and black mold, end quote. They reported that virtually all U.S. air traffic control sites were understaffed, forcing controllers to work 10-hour days, 6 days a week. These unsustainable work schedules have caused workers to develop physical and mental health problems, but they avoid seeking help for fear of not meeting medical clearances to keep their jobs. Some controllers who spoke with the New York Times say that under these conditions, they believe a deadly crash in the United States is inevitable. Many felt they had no choice but to leave the industry entirely, compounding staffing shortages. The FAA believes 10% of the total workforce will quit the job in this fiscal year. Pilots face similarly enormous pressures, leading many to also develop physical and mental health problems. They too avoid getting the help they need because of the risk of losing their jobs. Many have quit or turned down promotions that would lead to unpredictable flying schedules. Over 7,000 pilots declined to be promoted to captain at American Airlines. The number of pilots declining promotions has doubled in the past 7 years, according to the airline. There is now a massive pilot shortage. There are around 18,000 fewer commercial pilots than the industry needed in 2023. American Airlines has said that 1/3 of its 15,000 pilots will retire within the next 7 years. The number of travelers is almost back to its pre-pandemic levels, but airlines are struggling to keep up without enough pilots to fly the planes. The problem is so bad that American Airlines is cutting some flights short and forcing customers to take a bus to complete their trip, an even further insult to working people who are already paying an arm and a leg for air travel. Chronic financial distress has been the norm for many flight attendants, with wages so low they often qualify for food stamps and other public assistance. Many have to sleep in their cars while on call for a shift, a call that may or may not come. As the Seattle Times reported last month, 2 Alaska Airlines flight attendants started a private Facebook page titled, quote, Alaska Airlines FAs Experiencing Hunger and Homelessness, end quote. The group shares countless stories of financial problems facing flight attendants and tips on where to get free food in the cities to which the airline flies.
Is everyone in the aviation industry hurting? Not quite. Surprise, surprise, the CEOs and other top executives of Boeing, Spirit Aerosystems, and the airline corporations have been taking home countless millions of dollars every year. With all this money, what do you think Alaska Airlines executives think a near-fatal flight experience is worth? They've offered passengers an insulting $1,500 each. And who are the primary shareholders of Boeing and the airlines? It's the usual suspects like BlackRock, Vanguard, and Geode, some of the most powerful Wall Street investment firms headed by multi-billionaires. They are also the same corporate oligarchs presiding over the rental home industry and the railroads of America. So what do we do about all of this? Whether it's defending the lives of passengers or improving the wages and working conditions of the workers, any change in the aviation industry can only come from an organized working class fight back. And we need serious, systemic solutions. The crisis in the aviation industry and the fact that tens of thousands of lives are put at direct risk every single day as billionaires compete with other billionaires to maximize profits also raises the question of how the industry should be run, for profit or for safety. And if we want a safe, rational system, who should actually own and control it? Billionaires or working people? Workers in this industry are fed up with deteriorating, dangerous conditions, and they're getting organized. On February 13th, flight attendants will hold a day of action at over 30 airports worldwide. The Global Day of Action is a united call by the Association of Professional Flight Attendants, Association of Flight Attendants CWA, and Transport Workers Local Union 556, which together represent over 100,000 flight attendants. The Association of Professional Flight Attendants put out a statement that said, quote, like every other worker around the world, we need to go to work to live, not just live to work. We are ready to do whatever it takes to achieve the landmark contracts that reflect the profits our work creates. Together, 100,000 flight attendants are pushing our careers forward this year, battling corporate greed, end quote. More than 2/3 of the U.S. flight attendants are currently in contract negotiations, including contract fights at American, Alaska, United, and Southwest. Recently, flight attendants at Southwest Airlines rejected a tentative contract agreement, with 64% of them voting against the proposed 5-year deal. On January 13th, Brussels Airlines pilots held a wildcat strike over benefits that haven't kept up with inflation. The Teamsters in the U.S. are forming a coalition to unionize over 50,000 workers at Delta, including ramp, tower, and cargo workers, flight attendants, and mechanics. In May last year, 99% of the rank-and-file members of the Southwest Airlines Pilots Association voted to approve a strike mandate for the first time in the company's history, with 98% of members participating in the vote. They will be voting until January 22nd on a tentative agreement that would raise wages by 50% over 7 years and increase retirement benefits. And in September, an overwhelming 99.47% of American Airlines flight attendants voted to authorize a strike, with over 93% of eligible flight attendants participating in the vote. American Airlines is operated by over 26,000 flight attendants unionized with the Association of Professional Flight Attendants, who are demanding better pay and working conditions against the corporation's reported $1.3 billion profit in the second quarter of last year. This year, the contract will expire for Seattle area Boeing machinists unionized with IAM District 751. According to one worker, they're fired up to win the cost of living increases they've gone more than 10 years without, including preparing for a strike.
It's been 10 years since the negotiation. However, it has been 16 years since our last contract. Our last contract was 2008. There was a 4-year extension. And at the end of that 4-year extension, the union president, so to speak, made a deal with Boeing behind closed doors, and then they had the vote be on January 2nd, the day people came back from vacation. And a lot of people weren't back yet. And so they just they forced a vote, and it passed. And that was after that 4-year extension. And it was, we lost pensions, we lost insurance benefits, like certain insurance benefits, but pensions was the big one. And they didn't include a bunch of stuff that the union had been discussing that they wanted to include for a while. Nobody agreed to that. But what Boeing will do is they'll go, hey, we're going to take this, but everybody will get a $10,000 bonus. Oh, you get 10 grand, and it's like, okay, I get 10 grand now, but then I'll never make any more money later. The union is aware that happened, and being real, everybody who's there is pissed about it and has been pissed for 10 years. They actually found out after the fact that that guy had the power to just to open the contract, negotiate, close it, and sign the deal without anyone else's involvement. That is how powerful that position was at the time. That was like a top union leader, and I mean, again, like everybody felt so betrayed. But because of that, they were like, we're never going to let that happen again. And so, that position has been heavily restricted, and there's been, a dozen amendments added to the union constitution to make sure that can never happen again. There's a lot of great benefits, and I know that those benefits aren't because Boeing wanted to give them to me. Those are benefits that the union has fought for the last 35 years. And, especially after what happened last time with union negotiations, the union is fiery. They're ready to go. And I definitely think that these incidents are going to, I think this will help the union during negotiations later this year, because we can go, hey, look what's happening under your leadership. Look what you're doing. Like we're doing our best to build these planes, and you're not letting us. You're not letting us do our jobs the right way every time because you want stuff to be fast. And obviously, again, if you've ever worked any retail or anything like that, it's like your employer's not going to be like, oh, you need to go faster, but they're going to kind of hint at it. They're going to kind of nudge you. Work at 110% today, guys. Everybody work at 110% so you can get stuff done. And it's like, no, that's not how you get good work. And it definitely just feels like, again, the only goal is make a plane as fast as possible so we can make another one as fast as possible. It's been awesome to see the last, 2023 was kind of the year of unions, which is really awesome. Seeing Starbucks and UAW and all these unions just kind of finally get back on their feet and be like, no, we're not taking this anymore. And I think with that, I think the public opinion's a lot more in support of unions. And so I think this fall is going to be really, really interesting for Boeing and for the Aerospace Machinists Union, because I mean, just this is the time. So you saved all this money doing this 10 years ago, and that money obviously didn't go into safety. So where was it going?
The current fight back follows the historic role played by aviation industry workers in ending the 2019 U.S. government shutdown, handing the then President Trump a humiliating defeat. This victory, which brought an end to the longest government shutdown to date, did not happen because of the clever tactics of Democrats Nancy Pelosi or Chuck Schumer. The shutdown was ended due to the powerful actions of air traffic controllers and TSA agents at some of the country's busiest airports by refusing to go to work. Sarah Nelson, the president of the Association of Flight Attendants, called on flight attendants across the country to skip work and organize mass sit-ins of congressional offices until the shutdown ended. Paul Rinaldi, president of the Air Traffic Controllers Association, declared at the time that air traffic controllers were not going to come to work if they didn't feel fit for duty, and that the government shutdown had to end. These are crucial steps forward, and we should learn from them, but workers also need to take it much further, especially through stepping up strike action. And part of ensuring victories is learning important lessons from history. PATCO, or the Professional Air Traffic Controllers Organization, was a union that operated from 1968 to 1981. In the late 70s, Democratic President Jimmy Carter deregulated the airline industry, cut corporate taxes, and cut back funding for some social welfare programs. Air traffic controllers were, like other workers, deeply frustrated by this. However, rather than recognize that neither the Democrats nor the Republicans represent working people and the need to begin building independent working-class organizations, the air traffic controllers decided to support Carter's Republican opponent in the 1980 election, Ronald Reagan. Reagan had promised that if elected, he would work to address controllers' concerns, but predictably, he did the opposite. After his election, he completely turned his back on them and retaliated against the PATCO strike instead in one of the most dishonest and vicious examples of strike breaking in the annals of American capitalism. In the 1981 negotiations, PATCO was calling for a reduced 32-hour work week, a $10,000 pay increase for all air traffic controllers, and a better benefits package for retirement. After negotiations stalled, they were forced to declare a strike, which violated federal law, a totally anti-worker, anti-union federal law, which prohibits striking by federal employees. Immediately, Reagan brought out the state apparatus against the strikers. He called the strike a, quote, peril to national safety, end quote, and ordered the air traffic controllers back to work under the terms of the anti-union Taft-Hartley Act. The PATCO workers refused to return to work, so the Reagan administration fired the 11,345 striking air traffic controllers who had ignored this order and banned them from federal service for life. Federal marshals and the FBI were used to hunt down strikers. Their phones were tapped and their families were harassed. Strikers were arrested, fined, and jailed. The Union Strike Fund was seized by the courts, and Reagan declared the strike, quote-unquote, over. The union was decertified in October 1981 and forced into bankruptcy by the courts. Attempts to use the capitalist courts to appeal that ruling and to reverse the firings proved futile. And as union workers across the country held their breath in anticipation of a sorely needed call to action, the AFL-CIO national labor leadership was instead largely silent. This was disaster on top of disaster. It was imperative that the unions counter the attack with a national shutdown of air travel and mass demonstrations across the country against Reagan and the bosses, but they did virtually nothing.
Corporate America, on the other hand, seized the moment to launch an all-out assault on labor. The federal takedown of PATCO was a green light for big business to go to war against the unions.
Reagan's handling of the strike got into business school curriculum, quickly, within a year.
By 1982, there was a group at the Wharton School that came out with a manual which encouraged business leaders to learn from the PATCO strike. And this was widely disseminated, and business leaders were reading about it.
Suddenly around America, strike breaking became the thing to do. Striking copper miners in Arizona, fired. Striking paper workers in Maine, fired. Meat packers, bus drivers. So many strikes in the 1980s were broken to the point where unions realized that employers wanted them to strike so that they could fire them and replace them with non-union workers. And if you realize that your boss wants you to strike so they can fire you and rehire somebody else, that is going to make you less likely to strike. The main piece of leverage unions have.
The revived doctrine of permanent replacement was used to break strike after strike in the 1980s and 90s. Today, we see the results of this ongoing assault by big business and capitulation of much of the labor leadership. Low levels of unionization, wages and working conditions for the broad mass of workers that have collapsed while corporate profits soar. Most of the national labor leadership has continued to refuse to fight back and has embraced business unionism, leading to further attacks and decline in workers' rights and union density. In its 12 years of existence, PATCO had developed a reputation as a union that was aggressively defending its members' working conditions, public safety, and the reform of air traffic control practices. Through a series of militant job actions, sick-outs, and slowdowns, they had won union recognition, serious gains in wages and working conditions, and had engaged the FAA and the airlines in a public discussion about air travel safety and regulation. One of the key demands of the union in 1981 was relief from the Civil Service Reform Act, which would give them full recognition as an industrial union and the legal right to strike. But despite its militancy, PATCO was hamstrung by a lack of internal democracy and a failure to build solidarity with other unions in the industry. And sadly, the union's leadership had faith in Reagan's promises, which laid the ground for the union's downfall. This is a cautionary tale for all workers. Neither the Republicans nor the Democrats support workers and unions. We need our own party and representatives who are accountable to us and won't betray us. When Washington state Democrats were giving Boeing that massive handout we talked about earlier in this episode, Sharma had just been elected to the city council. As an open socialist and genuine working class representative, not a Democrat, she stood in solidarity with Boeing workers during a rainy evening rally against the betrayal by the Democratic-led legislature and Democratic Governor Jay Inslee. At that rally, Sharma condemned Boeing's actions as economic blackmail and said that if Boeing tried to take jobs away, workers should take the factories into public ownership and run them democratically themselves. This didn't happen, unfortunately, but it's necessary for working class representatives to talk about what is needed to fight back and to win. And it's a lesson for today as the airline industry falls deeper into crisis.
Companies that are so integral to public infrastructure and safety like Boeing, Spirit Aerosystems, and even all the airlines aren't safe in the hands of the billionaires. It's the workers who know how things should be run, and it's the workers who want to do their jobs well and keep people safe. Workers need to take these companies into democratic public ownership and run them in the public interest, with the whole industry organized democratically. And we need to go further. It's not just the airlines that can't be left to the billionaires. We need housing, broadband access, and not to mention the big energy corporations, all taken into democratic public ownership. The working class needs ownership of the commanding heights of industry as a whole. As it is currently organized, the airline industry and our fossil fuel-based transportation infrastructure have a deeply unsustainable impact on the planet. We need to immediately and rapidly transition towards an end to fossil fuel use. This will not happen under capitalism. These powerful industries and their two big business political parties will take us over the cliff of climate catastrophe if we let them, because their profits are fueled by the oil-based economy. Ending fossil fuel use will require taking on the big energy corporations, the auto industry, and the airline industry, who will fight us tooth and nail. Boeing and the aviation industry crisis are just the latest example of how big corporations and their billionaire shareholders act with complete disregard for human life and the planet. Unfortunately, none of this will be fixed by replacing the current corrupt executives with supposedly better ones any more than it will be by electing Democrats over Republicans or the reverse. It's this bankrupt system driven by insatiable greed. Imagine if Boeing executives somehow miraculously woke up and decided to stop cutting corners and pushing employees to work ever faster. Their profits would stall, and the board and the shareholders would fire whoever they needed to in order to get the profit machine back on track. There is real potential for a fight back across the entire aviation industry. There are major choke points in American capitalism that could halt the flow of profits and put enormous pressure on the bosses to concede to workers' demands. Aviation workers ensure the smooth flow of billions of dollars of goods and services, the profits of which go straight into the pockets of the ultra-wealthy. Workers can put a stop to air freight and air travel entirely and take back what is rightfully theirs. But as we've said often on this show, that will require class struggle unionism. On Strike will be closely following these important developments with flight attendants, pilots, Boeing workers, and others in the industry this year, and we will keep you updated. Next week, we will unfortunately not be able to bring you an episode of On Strike because of an important international conference taking place, but we'll be back on our regular weekly schedule on Friday, February 2nd. On Strike is a production of Workers Strike Back, a nationwide organization fighting on working class demands like a $25 an hour minimum wage, union jobs, Medicare for all, and against discrimination and oppression. Workers Strike Back is also calling for a new party for working people because neither the Republican Party nor the Democratic Party represents us. Find out more at workersstrikeback.org and donate. And look for us on Patreon to support our work. On Strike is a broadcast entirely for working people and funded entirely by working people. Solidarity.